She lived inside Graceland for decades, watching much of Elvis Presley's adult life unfold around her. When the world learned he had died, she was there. And when Graceland opened its doors to tourists, she stayed, hidden just off the kitchen, for 11 more years. Her name was Delta Biggs, and by the time she died in 1993, she was the last family member still calling Graceland home. What she saw was never meant for the public. So what was she hiding from, and why did it take so long for her story to come out? Before she became a footnote in Elvis Presley's story, Delta Mae Presley was just Vernon Presley's sister. That makes her Elvis's aunt. To the family, she was simply Aunt Delta. She married a man named Pat Biggs and lived a quiet life, far from the spotlight that had swallowed her nephew whole. But grief has a way of redrawing the map of a person's life. When Pat died, Delta found herself without a husband, without children, and without much reason to stay where she was. So she did what any Presley would do when the walls closed in. She went home. To Graceland. There was no press release. No headline. Just a widow moving in with relatives, the way families have always supported each other. Except this family happened to include the most famous entertainer alive. Delta moved into the mansion in 1967, joining Elvis's grandmother, Minnie Mae. This wasn't yet the Graceland of gift shops and tour buses. It was still just a house. A big, strange, beautiful house where a family was trying to hold itself together while one of its own turned into the most famous man on the planet. But here's the thing nobody talks about. What was it actually like, living under that roof, day after day? Delta wasn't reading about Elvis's career in magazines. She watched it happen from the next room, through Beatlemania, through his Hollywood years, through his Vegas comeback. And Elvis took care of the people close to him. That much is almost universally agreed on by everyone who knew him. He housed relatives who needed a place to land. Delta had a roof, a family, and a front row seat most people could only dream of. But a mansion full of family isn't automatically peaceful. Every person living there absorbed some version of the chaos that came with being related to a global superstar. The fans outside never stopped. The demands on Elvis's time never stopped. So what happens when a dream like that starts to crack? To understand what Delta witnessed, you have to understand what Graceland actually was back then. Not a museum. Not a tourist stop. A home, holding together under the weight of global fame. Elvis bought the estate in 1957, not just for himself, but for his parents, his grandmother, and eventually the extended family who would live there for decades. Inside those walls, the picture that emerges isn't simple. It's not Elvis the untouchable icon. It's closer to a portrait of a man split in two. One side, the family man who made sure everyone was housed and cared for. The other side, a man boxed in by his own legend, worn down by scrutiny and the exhausting machine of being Elvis Presley full-time. Delta saw both. She wasn't a fan outside the gates, she was family, sharing meals, sharing space, sharing the ordinary rhythms of a household that happened to have a rock and roll king wandering through it. She saw the tired version, the short-tempered version, right alongside the version who could still light up a room. That contrast, warmth and pressure sitting side by side, is really the heart of what makes this story worth telling. And then, on August 16, 1977, the family side of that story ended abruptly. Elvis died at Graceland at just 42. The king was gone. And the house he built for his family would never be just a family home again. So what happens to a home once the man who made it famous is gone? It didn't empty all at once. It emptied slowly, one loss at a time, and Delta watched almost every bit of it happen. Vernon Presley died 2 years after his son. Minnie Mae passed in 1980. One by one, the people who filled that house with noise and memory disappeared. The bedrooms emptied. The table got quieter. And that left Aunt Delta alone, holding down a home that increasingly felt like it belonged more to the world than to her family. In 1982, Priscilla Presley made the call to open Graceland to the public. It was a business decision, a preservation decision, and in some ways, an inevitable one. On opening day, more than 3,000 fans lined up to walk through a home that had, until recently, been entirely private. But that decision also meant something strange for the one person who still lived there. Delta's actual bedroom, her actual kitchen, was about to become part of a public attraction. And she wasn't leaving. So an arrangement was made. Delta kept her room, tucked just off the kitchen, away from the tour path. That space stayed off-limits to visitors for years, carved out so she could keep living exactly the way she always had, even as thousands of strangers moved through the rest of the house every single day. Which raises the question every visitor probably never thought to ask. While people snapped photos in the jungle room, what was happening just a few feet away, behind a door they weren't allowed to open? This is where Delta stops being a footnote and starts becoming genuinely fascinating. By day, Graceland ran like clockwork, tour groups moving past the white staircase and the piano room, everything curated for maximum reverence. And behind a closed door near the kitchen, an older woman with a small dog lived her actual, unglamorous life. According to family accounts, including from Elvis's daughter Lisa Marie, Delta had a sharp, unfiltered sense of humor about the whole thing. She wasn't always thrilled to be treated like a museum exhibit's neighbor. When curious tourists spotted her walking her dog and asked if she was Aunt Delta, she'd sometimes tell them Delta had died the night before. There's something almost funny about that image once it sinks in. A woman in her 60s, living in America's most visited private residence, gently messing with strangers instead of playing along. At night, once the last tour group filed out, something interesting happened. Delta had the run of the entire mansion to herself. According to Graceland's own archivist, she would sometimes rearrange parts of the house during those quiet hours, small acts of ownership over a space that legally belonged to an estate but had once simply been hers. She reportedly even weighed in on whether the home's decor should stay frozen exactly as it was the day Elvis died. So which version of Graceland was the real one? The polished museum thousands walked through every afternoon, or the after-hours house that only one woman still knew how to live in? Here's where a lot of the more sensational retellings start to stretch the truth. Search around and you'll find claims that Delta exposed some hidden scandal, some secret nobody else knew. The reality is less explosive, and honestly more interesting. Delta's real legacy isn't a bombshell. It's a decades-long, first-hand perspective on what it actually looked like to be related to Elvis Presley while the rest of the world turned him into a myth. She didn't need to expose a hidden crime, because the truth she carried was simpler. Elvis was generous with the people he loved. He kept family close even as fame pulled him further from a normal life. And the pressure of being Elvis Presley around the clock took a visible toll on the people living around him, Delta included. That's the hardest story to tell, because it doesn't fit into a clickbait headline. It's the story of a family trying to hold on to normal life inside a house the entire world wanted a piece of. It's the story of a woman who lost her husband, moved in with her nephew for comfort and stability, and ended up spending the rest of her life as the last living link between Graceland the home and Graceland the landmark. Her memories point in the opposite direction of every exaggerated celebrity tale. They remind us that fame doesn't erase ordinary life, it just makes ordinary moments harder to see. Family dinners. Quiet conversations. Long stretches where nothing dramatic happened at all. Those moments rarely make documentaries, but they might be the most revealing part of the whole story. Delta also represented something rare in Elvis's world, someone whose bond with him existed long before the records, the screaming fans, the Hollywood contracts. She knew the Presley family before they became American royalty. She wasn't defending a brand or protecting an image. She simply remembered the nephew she watched grow into a phenomenon. It's worth pausing on how rare that position really was. Nearly everyone who talks about Elvis is working from the outside. Biographers piecing together interviews, historians combing old clippings. Delta didn't need any of that. She lived it, day after day, inside those same four walls. When Delta passed away in 1993, something changed almost immediately. Her bedroom, the one space tourists had never been allowed to see, was restored to look the way it had when Elvis's parents lived there, and the kitchen was finally added to the public tour the following year. The last barrier between home and museum quietly disappeared the same year she did. As if the house itself had been waiting for her to finish living in it before it could become something else entirely. There's a strange kind of poetry in that timing. For 26 years, one small private corner of Graceland stayed exactly what it had always been, somebody's actual home. The moment that changed was the moment Delta was no longer there to occupy it. So was there ever really a secret to expose? Or was the real secret simply that, underneath the legend, underneath the gates and the gift shop and the guided tours, Graceland was, for a long time, still just somebody's house? Delta Biggs never wrote a tell-all. She never sat for some blockbuster interview promising to spill Elvis's darkest secrets. What she left behind was quieter, and in a lot of ways more honest. Proof that even inside the most famous house in America, someone was still just trying to live a normal life. Millions of people have walked through Graceland's front doors since it opened in 1982. They've stood in the jungle room, stared up at the gold records, stood quietly in the meditation garden where Elvis rests beside his parents and grandmother. Almost none of them ever knew that for 11 of those years, someone was still living there, just a few feet from the velvet ropes, finishing out an entire life inside a house the rest of the world had already turned into a monument. That's the part of this story that tends to get lost. Not a scandal. Not a hidden secret. Just a woman named Delta, who buried her husband, moved in with family, watched a nephew become a legend, watched that same nephew die far too young, and quietly held onto the last unclaimed corner of his childhood home until there was nothing left to hold on to.